A mafia boss never fears bullets. He fears what he cannot understand. Raphael Moretti built his empire on one rule: control everything, control everyone, control every word spoken in the room. But in Seoul, something happened that stripped that control away in seconds. A lost translator, a woman he didn't choose. And suddenly, every negotiation, every threat, every move he made depended on her voice translating his reality into something the world could understand. But what he didn't know was that someone was already manipulating the language between them long before they ever met. Every word she translated was not just communication, it was power being redistributed in real time. And when Raphael finally realized that the enemy wasn't at the table, but inside the translation itself, it was already too late to go back to being the man who controlled everything. This is a channel about mafia bosses, men born to dominate silence and command chaos. Some people are born to rule, and some lessons in life are never taught in schools, only learned in the world of men who understand power. This channel does not tell crime stories. It tells stories about mindset, discipline, emotional control, and the hidden psychology behind real power. The lesson of this story is simple but dangerous. You are never just hearing words, you are hearing someone else's interpretation of reality. And if you don't control how you are understood, you will never control what happens to you. If this story made you think differently, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal what real power looks like when language becomes the battlefield.
Raphael Morissetti had spent most of his adult life inside rooms where people either feared him, lied to him, or desperately wanted something from him. After a while, you learned the differences by instinct. Fear moved too quickly. Greed smiled too much. Liars usually blinked right before the important part. At 3:12 in the morning, somewhere over the Atlantic, Raphael sat alone in the rear cabin of his private jet with a glass of untouched espresso cooling beside his hand and a thick stack of shipping documents spread across walnut table in front of him. The rest of the plane was dark. His men knew better than to interrupt him during preparation. A small reading lamp cast a warm circle of light over the papers, while the engines hummed steadily beneath the silence. Outside the window, the world was nothing but black ocean and distant cloud cover glowing silver under moonlight. Raphael read without taking notes. He never needed notes. 20 years of negotiations, backroom buy deals, customs officials, union bosses, politicians, and dangerous men had trained his mind into something sharp enough to hold entire conversations word for word weeks after they happened. He could remember shipping manifests from 2017 better than most people remembered their wedding anniversaries. He turned one page, stopped, then looked up toward the front cabin. "Get Marco," he said calmly. The assistant sitting across from him hesitated almost invisibly. That hesitation changed the temperature in the room. Raphael's noticed immediately. Slowly, he leaned back in his seat. "What is it?" The assistant cleared his throat. "Marco is coming, sir." For a moment, the only sound was the low drone of the engines. Raphael's face did to change. Somehow that was worse. Explained. About 4 hours before the departure, he called saying there was a family emergency back in Jersey. He said he could to make the flight. And you retelling me this now because we thought it was before takeoff. Raphael stared at him for several long seconds, not angry. Calculating. Marco Bellini had worked beside him for 8 years. In Raphael's world, 8 years was longer than some marriages survived. Marco translated negotiations in Naples, Marseille, Montreal, and Sao Paulo. He knew when Raphael wanted a sentence softened and when he wanted it to land like a knife across a table. More importantly, Marco understood silence. That mattered. Who found the replacement? Whitmore as communications office and someone local in London. Credentials? Strong. Corporate negotiations, diplomatic work, international arbitration. References checked out. What's her name? Eleanor Vale. Raphael said nothing. He looked back down at the documents, but he wasn't reading them anymore. A replacement translator meant variables. Variables meant risk, and Raphael Moretti hated entering rooms where another person controlled what he heard. When he was 12 years old, his father died in a Newark hospital because nobody on the night shift spoke enough Italian to understand what the old man was trying to say. Raphael still remembered standing the bee bulbous while nurse misunderstood question after question. His father kept up asking for water. They thought he was asking about medication. By the time someone finally understood him, he was gone. Raphael had never forgotten the look on his father's face during those final confused minutes. Not fear, worse than fear, isolation. Ever since then, Raphael avoided situations where language could make him powerless. Now he was flying into one voluntarily. He closed the folder in front of him. Fine, he said quietly. Wheatland, in 4 hours. I want every background file on Eleanor Vale waiting for me when we arrive. Yes, sir. The assistant relaxed slightly. That was mistake number one. Raphael noticed that too. London greeted them with rain. Not dramatic rain, not cinematic storms. Just the cold gray kind that soaked sidewalks and turned glass buildings into blurred mirrors under the early morning sky. By the time Raphael arrived at the Blackstone Hotel in Tigray in Mayfair, the city was just beginning to wake up. Black sedans moved through wet streets. The delivery trucks rattled along narrow intersections. Men in expensive coats carried coffee cups like survival equipment. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume. Raphael stepped inside with 2 men behind him and immediately saw her. Eleanor Vale stood near one of the marble columns holding a paper coffee cup up in one hand and a leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm. She wore a dark charcoal coat over a black turtleneck, practical heels, and absolutely nothing about her suggested someone trying to impress wealthy men. That alone made Raphael look twice. People around power usually performed around it. She didn't tea. Several executives from Whitmore Global Dextech crossed the Lee while speaking quietly among themselves. Every one of them acknowledged Eleanor, politely, but none of them stopped. None of them asked if she needed anything. None of them actually saw her. Raphael noticed that immediately. Interesting, he thought. Eleanor looked up as he approached. No nervousness, no artificial confidence either. Just direct eye contact from someone used to walking into rooms where powerful men underestimated her for the first seconds. Mr. Moretti, she said. Not a question. Her voice was calm, low, controlled. Raphael stopped in front of her. Miss Vale. A brief silence settled between them. Not awkward, measured, professional, each studying the other. Raphael noticed details automatically. The exhaustion hidden beneath her posture. The way she shifted her weight slightly toward the exits without seeming aware of it. The fact that her coffee had gone untouched long enough to cool. She noticed things, too. The men behind Raphael watching everyone entering the lobby. The expensive watch Raphael never looked at because men like him measured time internally. The fact that, despite his reputation, he moved through space quietly. I reviewed the preliminary negotiation files, Eleanor said. There are several areas where communication problems are likely. Raphael almost smiled. Most to-go translators talked about vocabulary. She talked about problems. How much time do you need? 45 minutes before the Whitmore meeting. You'll have 30. I'll need 45. One of Raphael's menens glanced nervously between them. Raphael looked at Eleanor for another second, then nodded once. Fine. No victory flashed across her face. She simply accepted the answer. That impressed him more than confidence would have. The elevator ride upstairs was sized except for the faint music drifting through hidden ceiling speakers. Halfway up, Raphael spoke quietly in Italian to one of his men. Make sure nobody touches the luggage until I say otherwise. The bodyguard nodded. Eleanor stood facing the elevator doors without reacting. No flicker of recognition, no movement, nothing. Raphael felt that away unconsciously. When the elevator opened onto the executive floor, Eleanor stepped aside to let him exit first. Professional, controlled, but tired. Now that he was closer, Raphael could see it clearly. Not physical exhaustion exactly. Something older than that. The exhaustion of someone constantly translating themselves into versions other people preferred. He had seen that look before. Usually in wives of powerful men. Inside the suite, Raphael removed his coat and loosened his cuffs while his staff arranged documents across the conference table. Eleanor remained near the windows overlooking rain-soaked London. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she turned toward him. "There's something you should understand before the meeting today." Raphael poured himself fresh espresso, Sam listening. "Harrison Whitmore doesn't gaze and negotiate emotionally. His son does." She paused carefully. "Those are two very different conversations." Raphael studied her over the rim of his cup. "And which one are you translating for? A smaller person might have stumbled there. Eleanor didn't. TT. That depends entirely on which version of yourself you decide to bring into the room." Interesting, Raphael thought again. Very interesting. Before he could answer, her phone vibrated softly in her coat pocket. She glanced down automatically, and for less than a second, something slipped through her composure. Not fear, not panic. Fatigue, the kind carried by people who had spent too long being useful to everyone around them. Then it vanished. Professionalism restored instantly. But Raphael had already seen it. She slid the phone back into her pocket. "Mr. Whitmore moved the meeting forward by 20 minutes, she said calmly. "Apparently, there's urgency on the legal side." Raphael nodded slowly. "Of course there is." Eleanor gathered her portfolio. As she turned toward the door, Raphael noticed the edge of her phone screen still faintly glowing from the unread message notification. He couldn't see the entire text, only part of it. But the words he did catch were enough to make something cold settle quietly into place at the back of his mind. Did he open the suitcase yet? The door closed behind her. Raphael stood motionless for several seconds. Then he looked toward the black leather suitcase resting beside the wall near the bedroom door. And for the first time since leaving New York, Raphael's Moretti felt the unmistakable sensations that someone had entered the game before he even arrived at the table. London's morning rain had not stopped by the time Raphael Moretti stepped into the armored black vehicle waiting outside the Blackstone Hotel, but by then he had already stopped noticing the weather. Rain was background noise in cities like this, like money, like politics, like the quiet tension between people who smiled while calculating each other's S-value. What mattered was not the storm outside, but the one forming inside the structure of his day. Eleanor Vale was already inside the car when he entered. She sat in the opposite seat, not beside him, which was intentional. Everything about her suggested someone who understood boundaries, not just physical ones, but psychological ones. She had her portfolio on her lap, one hand resting lightly on it, other scrolling notes through on her phone. When Raphael got in, she looked up once, acknowledged him with a small nod, and returned to her preparation. No unnecessary greeting. No performative politeness. Raphael respected that immediately. The car pulled away from the curb, tires slicing through wet pavement as they entered fair traffic. The driver stayed silent. Then the bodyguard in the front seat did not turn around. Everyone in the vehicle understood the hierarchy. Raphael spoke when necessary. Everything else waited. Eleanor broke the silence first, but not casually. "We have 38 minutes to the Whitmore building," she said, glancing at her screen. "That's assuming traffic stays consistent. It won T. There's a security checkpoint near Westminster causing delays." Raphael watched her instead of the road. "You adjust meetings like this often?" he asked. "I adjust outcomes," she replied without looking up. "Meetings are just where people realize what already changed." That answer landed differently than most people realized it would. Most translators focused on words. She focused on consequences. Raphael leaned back slightly in his seat, studying her the way he studied contracts he suspected contained invisible traps. "You've worked with political delegations before," he said. "Yes." "But which ones?" She hesitated for the first time. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But Raphael caught it. "Privates there mostly," she said, finally, "some diplomatic advisory work." That wasn't a full answer. It was a controlled answer, a filtered truth. Raphael noted it, but didn't press yet. Instead, he shifted the conversation. "Tell me about Whitmore." Eleanor exhaled softly, like she had been expecting that question and was relieved it arrived early. Harrison Whitmore is predictable, she said. He values legacies over innovation, which makes him cautious. His son, Daniel, values perception over legacy, which makes him dangerous in a different way. And you translate for both? I translate for whoever is speaking, she corrected. But I interpret intention for myself. Raphael turned slightly toward her. That's a dangerous habit. So is misunderstanding the room is you re-standing in. There was no hostility in her voice, only clarity. The cars slowed as they approached Westminster. Traffic thickened, pedestrians moved quickly under religlas, and the city's morning rhythm shifted into controlled chaos. Raphael watched everything through the window, but part of his attention remained on her. She wasn't nervous, that was important. Most people, especially those new to his world, changed in subtle ways when they knew who he was. Their breathing adjusted, their sentences shortened. Their confidence either inflated or collapsed. Eleanor Vale did neither. She remained structurally consistent. That made her either extremely competent or extremely dangerous. Raphael preferred competence. Danger he could usually manage. The car stopped near a security checkpoint where uniformed personnel guided vehicles through slow inspection cleansins. One of Raphael's men leaned forward slightly. Delay is 7 minutes, the driver said. Eleanor didn't react to the delay. Instead, she used it. We should go over the phrasing for the opening statement, she said, opening her portfolio. Whitmore legal team is sensitive to language that implies acquisition pressure. They interpret it as coercion, even in standard contract language. Raphael frowned slightly. In business terms, everything is coercion, he said. In your world, she replied, yes. In theirs, it has legal consequences. That distinction mattered more than she was saying aloud. Raphael studied her again. You not just translating language, he said slowly. You retranslating liability. Eleanor finally looked at him directly. Yes. The simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation would have. The car moved forward again. As they crossed the checkpoint, Raphael noticed something subtle. Eleanor's posture shifted ever so slightly. Not defensive, not alert in the way of fear, but attentive in a way that suggested she had mentally entered a different layer of awareness. He recognized that layer. It was the layer buckled when they were about to step into rooms where mistakes became extensive. The Whitmore building rose ahead of them, glass and steel, reflecting the gray sky like a muted blade. It was the kind of corporate architecture designed to project control without explicitly stating it. Raphael had seen variations of it in New York, Milan, Tokyo, cities that believed glass made them honest. It didn't. It only made them visible. Inside the elevator, silence returned. This time it felt heavier. Eleanor stood beside Raphael, but not too close. The bodyguard stayed in the back corner. Raphael's watched the floor numbers rise while the mirrored walls reflected fragmented versions of all of them. Halfway up, Eleanor spoke without looking at him. Before we go in, she said, there is something important you should understand. Raphael didn't respond immediately. He waited. That waiting was deliberate. He never gave people free urgency. Finally, he said, go ahead. Harrison will test you indirectly, she said. He won't challenge your authority. He'll challenge your patience. Daniel will try to speed you up. Neither of them will ask for what they actually want. Raphael nodded slightly. And what do they actually want? Eleanor hesitated again, but this time it was not uncertainty. It was selection. They want to know if you're predictable, she said. Raphael smiled faintly at that. That's easy, he said. I am. Eleanor didn't respond to that, which told him she didn't believe him. The elevator doors opened. The Whitmore executive floor was brighter than the rest of the building, flooded with natural light from floor to sailing windows overlooking the Thames. Everything inside was polished, intentional, designed to communicate success as a form of architecture. Harrison Whitmore stood near the center of the conference room when they entered, older than Raphael expected. Calmer, not theatrical. That was always more dangerous. Beside him stood Daniel Whitmore, early 40s, sharp suit, restless energy, eyes that moved too quickly across people instead of settling. Two different kinds of power, one inherited, one anxious. Eleanor stepped forward first. Mr. Whitmore, she said smoothly. Mr. Moretti's has arrived. She didn't translate the introduction. She didn't need to. Raphael stepped into the room. Harrison Whitmore extended his hand. Raphael shook it. Firm, measuring, neutral. The kind of handshake that contained no information unless you knew how to extract it. Daniel watched from the side, already calculating. The meeting began with formalities that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Eleanor translated when necessary, but as the conversation progressed, Raphael noticed something subtle. She was Tep simply converting words. She was adjusting emotional tone. When Whitmore spoke with mild aggression disguised as curiosity, she softened it just enough in translation that it became diplomatic. When Raphael responded with calm authority that carried implied pressure, she preserved it without amplification. She was balancing on the room like a scale, and everyone in it was unconsciously trusting her calibration. That was power, not loud power. Invisible power. Midway through the goose negotiation, Daniel leaned forward. "We were concerned about delivery timelines," he said. Eleanor were translated cleanly. But Raphael noticed her pause before the final phrase. Just a fraction of a second. He caught it. Daniel continued, unaware. "Our clients expect consistency." Eleanor translated again. This time, Raphael watched her mouth more than Daniel, and he realized something important. She wasn't just translating meaning. She was choosing which version of meaning survived. That realization shifted something internal. Raphael began listening not to Daniel, but to Eleanor. The meeting continued. Numbers were discussed, routes debated, legal frameworks dissected, but underneath it all, something else was happening. A silent negotiation between Raphael and Eleanor that no one else in the room could see. At one point, Harrison Whitmore said something under his breath too quiet for the room. Daniel didn't hear it. Raphael didn't hear it. But Eleanor did. And she didn't translate it. She chose not to. That omission was not accidental. Raphael noticed immediately. His eyes shifted slightly toward her. She didn't look back. But her posture tightened just enough to confirm she knew he had noticed. Now there were two conversations happening, the spoken one and the controlled one. After 90 minutes, the meeting paused briefly for water and documents. Raphael stepped toward the window, looking out over London. Eleanor followed him, not physically close, but close enough to speak privately, without drawing tension. "You didn't translate everything," Raphael said quietly. It wasn't a question. Eleanor didn't deny it. "No," she said. "Why?" Because not everything spoken in rooms like this is meant to be carried forward," she replied. Raphael turned slightly toward her. "That's not your decision. It is when the omission protects clarity instead of distorting it." Raphael studied her for a long moment. "You understand what you're redoing is selective control." "Yes, and you still do it." Eleanor Swift met his gaze. "Yes, no apology, no justification, just ownership." That was the moment Raphael understood something fundamental. She wasn't afraid of responsibility, which meant she could be trusted or feared, depending on alignment. Before he could respond, Eleanor's phone vibrated again. This time, she didn't hide it quickly enough. Raphael saw her glance. He saw the change, subtle but real. The mask adjusted. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated, then answered. "My previous client's office keeps asking about this chase." Raphael's expression didn't change, but internally something aligned. Because now the pattern had a shape. And shapes could be hunted. He looked back toward the conference table where Harrison Whitmore was returning to his seat. Then back to Eleanor. And for the first time since landing in London, Raphael Moretti understood the real negotiation wasn't happening in this building at all. It was happening between what was being said and what she chose to translate next. Eleanor Vale didn't speak again for almost 10 minutes after the Whitmore meeting resumed, and Raphael San absent that silence in a way she hadn't expected to. Not because she was supposed to be constantly talking, she wasn't tea, but because the absence of her voice changed the rhythm of the room. When she translated, she didn't simply carry meaning across languages. She stabilized tension like a skilled hand steadying a live wire. Without her, the negotiation felt slightly off-center, like a table missing one leggy that only revealed itself when its weight was applied. Harrison Whitmore continued speaking about logistics, but Raphael wasn't fully listening anymore. He had already understood the structure of Whitmore's position within the first 20 minutes. Cautious expansion, risks managed partnerships, legacy protection disguised as modernization. That part was predictable. What he was paying attention to now was Silchas. She stood slightly behind and to the cease kind of die the tables, as was customary for interpreters in formal corporate environments. But her sitter suggested something more active than observation. Her eyes moved between speakers before they finished their sentences. She anticipated pauses. She adjusted breathing in sync with shifts in tone. She wasn't reacting to the conversation, she was slightly ahead of it, like someone reading music while others were still hearing notes. That kind of cognitive distance wasn't common. Raphael had worked with interpreters before. Good ones, even exceptional ones. But most of them were reactive by necessity. They waited for words, then transformed them. Eleanor didn't wait in the same way. She was already deciding structure before speech fully formed. And that meant she was influencing outcomes in ways most people in the room didn't even have language for. As those Harris socials forward slightly, gestures leaned toward a document on the table. We need assurance on continuity across all regional hubs, he said. Eleanor translated smoothly into Raphael's language. Her voice precise, but something subtle shifted at the end of the sentence in emphasis, almost invisible, that framed assurance not as request but as demand softened by etiquette. Raphael caught it instantly, not because it was obvious, but because it was Titi. He studied her again, more carefully now. There was a pattern forming. Every time Whitmore applied pressure, Eleanor softened it just enough to keep the negotiation stable. Every time Raphael resembled with controlled authority, she preserved its weight without amplifying hostility. It wasn't a distortion, it was calibration. She was balancing perception like a translator adjusting pressure in a sealed system to prevent rupture. That was interpretation, that was governance. Raphael had seen people manipulate language before. Lawyers did it. Politicians lived inside it. But Eleanor's manipulation was defensive or strategic in the traditional sense. It was structural. She was trying to win either side. She was trying to prevent the system from collapsing under its own emotional weight. That realization made him pause internally. Because people that socialize systems like that usually understand more than they reveal. The meeting moved forward. Documents were exchanged, numbers reviewed, delivery timelines debated. Daniel Whitmore attempted to introduce urgency again, pushing for accelerated implementation, and Eleanor translated his tone, carefully removing just enough pressure that it became ambition instead of impatience. Raphael noticed something else in those moments. Daniel wasn't just speaking to Raphael. He was performing competence in front of his father. And Eleanor was the only person in the room fully translating that secondary layer. That meant she saw things even Harrison Whitmore might not fully acknowledge. Which meant she was just an interpreter. She was a reader of hierarchy. After 2 hours, the meeting reached a temporary pause for internal review. Papers were collected, assistants moved quietly, and conversation dropped into smaller clusters. It was the kind of controlled break that corporate environments used to prevent fatigue from turning into mistakes. Raphael stepped away first, moving toward the windows, overlooking the Thames. The river was slow and gray, reflecting the sky like a dull mirror. London always looked like it was holding something back, he thought, even its weather. Eleanor didn't immediately follow him. That alone was notable. Most interpreters stayed close to their client as instinct. Proximity was safety. Proximity was control. But she remained at the table for a few seconds longer, answering a quiet question from one of Whitmore's legal advisors before finally stepping away. When she did approach Raphael, it was rushed. It wasn't hesitant either. It was deliberate. "You are not satisfied," she said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. It was a question. Raphael didn't turn fully toward her at first. "I'm never satisfied," he replied. "That's not what I meant." He glanced at her now, then clarify. Eleanor exhaled softly through her nose, a sign of calculation rather than frustration. "You reevaluating the room differently now than you were at the beginning of the meeting." Raphael almost smiled. That That's my job. No, she corrected. Your job is to negotiate. What you read doing is something else. That word something else hung between them slightly longer than it should have. Raphael studied her face. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just controlled awareness. It's like she was carefully measuring how far she could step into dangerous territory without losing footing. You noticed, he said finally. Yes. And you didn't say anything during translation. I did need. That answer landed harder than expected. Raphael turned slightly more toward her. Explain that. Eleanor held his gaze. Daniel Whitmore is trying to impress his father, she said. Harris's Whitmore is trying to ushilizera which his son is still his ability. You don't need me to translate words to understand that. You already see it. Raphael nodded slowly. And you? Eleanor paused. For me? She asked. Yes. What are you doing in the room? That question changed the air between them. Not dramatically, but structurally. Eleanor looked away for the first time, toward the window instead of him. I am preventing misunderstandings from becoming decisions, she said. That's not sort of role, Raphael replied. It is in rooms like this. He studied her profile now. There was something carefully contained in her expression. Not vulnerability, exactly. Something closer to fatigue shaped into professionalism over a long period of repetition. The kind of fatigue that didn't break people, it trained them. Who trained you? He asked. The question was simple, but her reaction was in tea, a brief tightening around her. A pause too precise to be accidental. No one, she said it finally. That was a lie. Rafa didn't call it out. Not yet. Instead, he shifted. Tell me something, he said. Eleanor looked back at him. You said Whitmore doesn't negotiate emotionally, his son does. Yes. How long have you known them? 3 years. And in those 3 years, as Raphael continued, how many times have you adjusted meaning in a rooms like this without telling your client? Eleanor didn't respond immediately. That silence was longer than the others. Finally, she said, enough times to know when it matters. Raphael nodded once. That answer was not satisfying, but it was informative. The meeting resumed shortly after, and Eleanor returned to her position beside the table, resuming translation as if the previous conversation had not occurred. But something changed. Raphael could feel it in how phrasing slightly more precise, slightly less adaptive. She had adjusted her own influence. That meant she was aware of it. The negotiation moved into some technical phase. Contract structuring, liability clauses, jurisdictional language. These were the areas where most people lost focus, where fatigue created mistakes that later became leverage. Raphael did not lose focus, neither did Eleanor. But something unexpected happened during a discussion about shipping liability across European ports. Harrison Whitmore said something under his breath in tone too low for general translation. Daniel didn't hear it. The legal team didn't react, but Eleanor did. And this team, she didn't translate immediately. She paused, just long enough for Raphael to notice. Then she translated only the formal portion of the sentence, omitting the private aside entirely. Raphael's eyes shifted toward her instantly. He didn't interrupt, but he filed it away. Another layer. Another selective omission. When the meeting finally concluded, it did so without resolution but with alignment agreements to continue, frameworks accepted, tension managed rather than resolved. In Raphael's Thou-es world, that was success. Handshakes were exchanged, polite statements made, assurances offered, but Raphael was already thinking beyond the room. As people began to exit, Eleanor gathered her materials with calm efficiency. No visible sign of relief, no change in posture that suggested the end of pressure. She simply transitioned states, like someone turning a page in a book mid-sentence. Raphael approached her before she could leave the room. Walk with me, he said. It wasn't a request. Eleanor didn't question it. She followed him into the corridor outside the conference rooms, where the noise of the meeting faded into distant corporate silence. The hallway was lined with glass and framed city views, the Thames visible again in fragmented reflections. Raphael stopped walking. Eleanor stopped as well. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Raphael said, You omitted part of his statement. Eleanor didn't deny it. Yes. Why? Because it wasn't relevant to the negotiation. That is not your decision to make. Eleanor looked at him directly now. In practice, she said, It is. Because if I translate everything exactly as spoken, you'd only get truth. You get noise. Raphael studied her for a long moment. You decide what noise is. I filter for intent, she corrected. That S still selection, yes. No apology, no justification, just acceptance of structure. Raphael nodded slightly. That makes you more than an interpreter, he said. Eleanor didn't respond, because she knew that was not a compliment. It was a classic hinge. Before anything else could be said, Raphael's phone vibrated. He glanced at it briefly, then looked back at her. They're something else, he said. Eleanor waited. My previous interpreter disappeared from the schedule the day before I left New York, he continued. You replaced him on short notice. Do you know why? A flicker crossed her expression, not surprise. Recognition. I was told it was a scheduling conflict, she said. Raphael held her gaze. And you believed that? Eleanor didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Raphael stepped slightly closer. I don't like variables I didn't authorize, he said quietly. Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. Neither do I, she replied. That was the first moment in the entire day where they spoke without professional distance as a buffer. Not friendly, not hostile, just direct alignment of principle. Then Eleanor added something softer. If your previous interpreter disappeared, it wasn't Stikaz because of me. Raphael watched her carefully. I didn't he say it was. A silence settled between them again, heavier than before. Somewhere down the hallway, a door closed. London continued outside the glass. And inside that quiet corporate corridor, Raphael Somishri began to understand that Eleanor Vale was to just translating conversations. She's standing in Steve's Einzu's space where information was being controlled. And she was doing it so precisely that most people would never notice she was there at all. The third day in London began with a different kind of silence, one that didn't come from absence, but from anticipation. The city outside Blackstone looked the same as before Gracehawker Sky. Wet streets, people moving quickly between obligations, but inside Raphael's Moretti-esque suite, everything felt slightly compressed, as if the air itself had recognized that something important was about to fracture. Eleanor Vale arrived exactly on time, not early, not late, exactly. That precision mattered more than most people realized in Raphael's world. Side timing wasn't just a discipline. It was a signal of internal structure. People who controlled their timing usually controlled other things too. She entered the suite without hesitation, placed her portfolio on the table, and only then acknowledged him. Whitmore requested a final clarification meeting, she said. Raphael was standing by the window, adjusting his cufflinks. After yesterday? He asked. After yesterday, she confirmed. He turned slightly toward her. And what changed overnight? Eleanor hesitated just long enough to be meaningful. Nothing official, she said, but unofficially, there is increased sensitivity around the shipment routes you proposed. Raphael's gaze sharpened slightly, that S vague. It's intentional, she replied. They don't know what they're reacting to yet. That answer was not comforting. It was informative. Raphael walked toward the table, where the suitcase for the fleet was now resting beside the wall, untouched since arrival. It sat there like an object that didn't belong to the room but had been allowed temporary residence. Eleanor noticed his glance toward it, but she didn't tease comment. That was the second thing Raphael noticed. Most people would have asked about it by now. She hadn't. Instead, she opened her portfolio and continued. Before we go in, there is a procedural issue, she said. Whitmore's faculties accessible wants confirmation that no third-party documentation has been introduced into your shipment records. The sentence was careful. Raphael looked at her directly. Explain that in plain language. Eleanor closed the portfolio slightly. They re-asking if anything in your cargo history looks like it does belong to you. A pause. Raphael didn't move, but something in the room tightened. Why would they ask us that? He said quietly. I didn't know, she replied, but her voice changed slightly at the end of that sentence. A fraction less certain. Raphael noticed. He always noticed. He walked toward the table slowly. Eleanor, he said, not raising his voice. She looked at him. Yes. Did you know about this request before today? A long pause, not dramatic. Controlled. Yes, she admitted. That single word shifted the entire structure of the room. Raphael stopped walking. Before today, he repeated. Yes. And you didn't tell me I was going to, she said. After I confirmed what they were actually looking for. Raphael studied her face for several seconds. This was not anger yet. It was something more dangerous. Assessment. You understand what this means, he said. Yes, she replied immediately. That was important. No hesitation this time. She understood. Raphael turned slightly away, as if organizing his thoughts internally. Outside, London traffic moved like nothing important was happening in the world. Inside, something had already shifted. Sit down, he said finally. Eleanor didn't question it, she sat. Raphael remained standing, a deliberate inversion of their usual dynamic. I want you to explain everything you know about Whitmore's request, he said. Eleanor opened her portfolio again, but didn't look down. They worried about discrepancies in shipment documentation from your previous European routes, she said, specifically southern ports. There are inconsistencies in declared cargo weights. Raphael nodded slowly. That's not unusual. It is when someone is looking for justification to reopen contracts, she replied. And are they? I don't know yet. Another pause. Raphael leaned slightly against the edge of the table.
Something yesterday.
He said. Eleanor looked up. What? You said you interpret intent for yourself. Yes. Apply it now. That request changed something in her expression. She didn't answer there immediately, because she understood what he was asking, not translation. Judgment. Finally, she said, not just checking compliance. Raphael waited. They looking for a reason to slow you down, she continued, or remove you entirely from the supply chain discussions. Why? Eleanor hesitated again, this time, longer. Then she said, because someone else is pushing for your routes. That sentence landed heavily. Raphael straightened slightly. Who? I don't know. That was honest, he could tell, but it wasn't complete. Raphael walked toward the suitcase once again. Eleanor's eyes followed him, but she didn't move. He stopped beside it. You've seen this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor's voice lowered slightly. No, a pause. Then she corrected herself. Not this exact situation. Raphael looked at her. That S not the same as no. Eleanor met his gaze. No, she admitted again. It S not. Silence filled the space between them. Not empty silence. Loaded silence. Raphael crouched slightly and placed his hand on the suitcase. You told me yesterday you filter for intent, he said. Yes. Then tell me the intent behind Whitmore's request. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She stood up slowly, walking closer to the table, stopping just behind him. They not asking about cargo, she said quietly. They asking if you've been moving something you haven't declared. Raphael didn't move, and what would make them think that? Eleanor paused. This time her hesitation wasn't professional. It was personal calculation. I don't know, she said carefully. But someone has introduced doubt into the system. Raphael finally stood. He turned toward her. And you think I am that system? No, she said immediately, but then softened it. I think you inside it. That distinction mattered. Raphael studied her carefully now. Eleanor, he said, yes. Is there anything you are not telling me? The question hung in the room longer than anything else that had been said that morning, Eleanor, and Ella didn't look away. Yes, she said. Raphael nodded slightly. That was expected. About what? She exhaled softly. The previous interpreter, she said. Raphael's expression didn't change. But the air did. Continue. Eleanor chose her words carefully. He didn't leave because of a scheduling issue, she said. He was removed from the assignment after someone flagged inconsistencies in prior translation logs. Raphael's eyes narrowed slightly. Flagged by who? I don't know, she admitted. But you know something else. Eleanor hesitated. Yes, say it. She looked at him directly now. I think someone is tracking what gets translated in your meetings. That sentence changed the temperature of the room. Raphael didn't respond immediately, because that implication was not about language. It was about surveillance, about control of information flow, about someone not just listening to him but studying how he was being interpreted. Finally, he said, why are you telling me this now? Eleanor's voice softened slightly. Because Whitmore's request confirms it, she said. They not just reacting to your cargo. They reacting to information they believe you already have access to. Raphael turned slightly away, thinking, not emotional reaction, structural recalculation. Outside, London continued its indifferent movement. Inside, something had reconfigured. Raphael looked back at the suitcase and then at Eleanor. You were involved in this more than admitted. he said. Eleanor didn't deny it. Immediately. That was the answer before the words arrived. I was brought in because of my prior work, she said finally. What prior work? Eleanor hesitated, then said government advisory translation for trade compliance investigations. That changed everything, not dramatically, but structurally. Raphael studied her carefully. You re not freelance, he said. I am now. Now, he repeated. Eleanor nodded, a controlled admission. Raphael stepped closer. Who released you? I wasn't he released, she said quietly. I stepped away. From what? Eleanor's jaw tightened slightly. That S not relevant into this meeting. Raphael held her gaze. It is now. Sounds again. Then a sound said, because I realized I was being used to interpret conversations that were already being pre-written. That answer was not fully clear, but it was honest enough to be dangerous. Raphael nodded, slowly. So you left? Yes. And now you re-here? Yes. Raphael turned slightly toward the window. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, someone knew I would replace Marco. Did respond immediately. Then, yes. Raphael looked at her sharply. You knew Marco wasn't coming. I was told the assignment was reassigned, she said. By who? I didn't know. Raphael walked back toward the suitcase. This is not random, he said. No, Eleanor agreed. It's structured. Yes. Raphael placed his hand on the suitcase again, then looked at her. And you re-inside the structure. Eleanor didn't deny it. But she said something carefully chosen. I think I am inside part of it, she said. That distinction mattered again. Raphael noticed. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at it. A message from his New York contacts. Short, urgent. He read it once, then again. Eleanor watched him carefully. What is it? She asked. Raphael didn't answer immediately. Then said, Whitmore just called an emergency internal review. Eleanor straightened slightly. That's not normal at this stage. No, Raphael agreed. His eyes shifted toward the suitcase. Someone accelerated it. Eleanor followed his gaze, and for the first time, she looked genuinely uncertain. What are you going to do? She asked. Raphael didn't answer immediately, because the answer had already begun forming. Finally, he said, We re-going to the meeting. Eleanor frowned slightly. Even with this, Raphael looked at her. Yes. And the suitcase? Raphael's expression hardened slightly. We re-going to find out why it matters. A pause. Eleanor studied him carefully, then said something quieter. You think it's connected. Raphael did answer immediately, but his silence confirmed it. Eleanor closed her portfolio slowly. Then we should be prepared for them to push harder than before, she said. Raphael nodded once. They already are. He picked up his coat. Eleanor, he said. She looked up. When we walk into that room, he continued, I want you to translate everything. She held his gaze. And nothing else? Raphael paused, then said everything. That word carried weight, because both of them understood what it meant now. No filtering, no omission, no protection. Just raw transmission of intent. Eleanor nodded once understood. But as she followed him toward Nodor, of them neither said what they were both beginning to realize. That the suitcase wasn't just a problem. It was a trigger. And whatever had been sent in motion before they even met was now close enough to start responding. The Whitmore headquarters felt different on the fourth day. Not physically. The glass, the steel, the polished marble floors were exactly the same, says some of them. The staff still moved with practiced efficiency. Coffee still arrived too quickly, and conversation still dropped into silence whenever Raphael Moretti passed through the corridors. But something beneath the surface had shifted, like a building whose foundation had begun to carry weight it was designed for. Eleanor Vale felt it the moment they stepped out of the elevator. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't need to. Raphael felt it too. It is in the way people looked at them now, not with a simple professional acknowledgement, but with measurement. As if everyone in the room had been quietly informed that the negotiation had stopped being routine. Something had entered the system, and no one had been told what it was. Harrison Whitmore was already in the conference room when they arrived. He stood at the far end of the table, not seated, which was unusual. Dan Whitman was says slightly more restless than before, flipping through documents he wasn't reading. Two legal advisors stood near the glass wall, saw used low tones that stopped the moment Raphael entered. Eleanor stepped forward first. Good morning, she said calmly. We re-ready. Her voice didn't carry tension, but her posture did. Raphael noticed it immediately. Not fear, adjustment. She was no longer just translating the room. She was preparing to survive it. Raphael walked in behind her, and the atmosphere tightened in response like a room recognizing a pressure differential. Harrison Whitmore didn't extend his hand, this time right away. Instead, he looked at Raphael for a long moment. Not hostile, not welcoming, assessing, then he spoke. Before we begin, Harrison said, there's an issue you need to address. Eleanor translated instantly, her voice steady, but Raphael's noticed something unusual. She didn't soften it. She didn't calibrate tone. She delivered it exactly as spoken. That alone told him everything he needed to know. Raphael stopped walking. Go on, he said. Harrison gestured toward the table. There are discrepancies in logistics records from the southern European routes, he said. We need clarification before proceeding further. Eleanor translated precisely, no adjustment, no interpretation. Raphael looked at her briefly. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second, then returned to her neutral position. That was new. Yesterday, she would have smoothed this. Today, she didn't. Because some things had changed in how she was choosing risk. Raphael turned back to Harrison. What kind of discrepancies? He asked. Eleanor translated. Daniel stepped forward slightly. Weight inconsistencies, he said quickly. Declaration mismatches. Small, but systematic. Eleanor translated again. Still exact, still unchanged. Raphael nodded slowly. And you rephrasing this now, he said, after 3 days of negotiation.
Eleanor translated.
Harrison answered without hesitation.
Yes, Eleanor alluded.
But this time, Raphael's nosius. Her pause before the final phrase. Barely a fraction of hesitation. Then she delivered it. That pause mattered. Because it meant she understood something's beneath it. Raphael looked at her again. Eleanor didn't react, but her hand, resting near her portfolio, tightened slightly, subtle, controlled. Raphael shifted his attention back to the room. You want clarification, he said. Eleanor translated. Yes, Harrison replied. Raphael nodded once. Then let S clarify. He sat, not slowly, not dramatically, just decisively. The room followed, even Harrison, even Daniel. Because movement like that resets hierarchy without words. Eleanor remained standing, positioned slightly behind Raphael's right side, her usual place. But she was no longer passive in it. Raphael could feel it. She was listening differently now. Not just translating speech, tracking intent divergence. The meeting resumed. Documents were brought forward. Legal summaries opened. Numbers displayed on tablets. Eleanor translated each exchange cleanly, but Raphael noticed that she was no longer adjusting tone at all. She had switched modes. Pure transmission, no interpretation layer. That shift changed the negotiation atmosphere immediately. Because without her stabilizing influence, tension behaved differently. It accumulated faster, sharper, more exposed. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward first. We need confirmation that no external routing manipulation has occurred, he said. Eleanor translated exactly. Raphael responded evenly. There has been no manipulation. Eleanor translated, but Harrison didn't react immediately. Instead, he watched Raphael carefully, not for truth, for inconsistency. Then he said something quieter, something not meant for formal translation. Eleanor heard it. Raphael saw her hear it. But she hesitated, just slightly, and then she translated only part of it. Raphael's eyes shifted instantly. The omission was deliberate, again. But this time, it was a softening. It was filtering something more dangerous. After the meeting paused briefly for document review, Raphael stood and walked toward the window at the far end of the room. Eleanor followed him, but not immediately. She waited until there was enough distance from the table, then approached. You re-changing how you translate, Raphael said quietly without turning. Yes, she replied. Why? Eleanor hesitated it. This environment is no longer stable, she said. Raphael turned slightly toward her. It was never stable. This is different. How? Eleanor looked toward the table where Whitmore and his team were now reviewing documents. Not just questioning logistics anymore, she said quietly. Looking for intent behind your operations. Raphael studied her. And you think I have hidden intent? No, she said immediately. That was fast. Too fast, Raphael noticed. But she added carefully. Someone has convinced them that you might. Silence. Then Raphael said, Who? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was different from before. He stepped closer. Eleanor. She exhaled slowly. I don't know, she said. But the way this is unfolding, it mirrors patterns he before. Raphael narrowed his eyes slightly. What patterns? Eleanor finally gave his gaze flee. Information prepositioning, she said. Before a contract is challenged, someone introduces uncertainty into the system. Not evidence, not proof. Just doubt. Raphael nodded slowly. And you've seen this where? Eleanor paused. A longer silence this time. Government compliance investigations, she said finally. That answered more than it revealed. Raphael studied her face carefully. You reside those investigations, yes? And now you rehear, yes. Raphael turned back toward the window. Outside, London moved like nothing important was happening. Inside, everything was recalculating. There's something else, Raphael said. Eleanor didn't express it immediately, but she already knew. Yes, she said quietly. Tell me. She hesitated, then said, Someone requested access to your historical shipping logs through a Sussex channel last week. Raphael turned sharply. Who? I don't know. But you know the system. Eleanor nodded once. Yes. Raphael stepped closer. Then tell me what that means. Eleanor chose her words carefully. It means someone is building a narrative around your operations, she said, not based on triviality, based on selective exposure. Raphael stared at her, and Whitmore is reacting to that narrative. Yes. A pause. Then Raphael said, and the suitcase. Eleanor stiffened slightly, but only slightly. It's part of it, she admitted. Raphael's eyes sharpened. How? Hesitated. Then said, because it creates the appearance of hidden leverage. Silence fell again. He nodded slowly. So that was it. Not the contents. Not yet. The implication. Raphael turned the tour table again. The meeting resumed. But now everything was different. Because Raphael was no longer negotiating a contract. He was inside a controlled interpretation of himself. And Eleanor, standing just behind him, was the only reason he could still see where the distortions were forming. At one point, Daniel Whitmore leaned forward again. There's also the question of third-party involvement, he said. Eleanor translated. But this was Raphael saw something in her expression before she spoke. Recognition. Just for a fraction of a second. Then gone. She translated cleanly, but Raphael caught it. After the meeting paused again, Raphael walked directly toward her. Not slowly, not casually. Eleanor did step back. You recognize something, he said quietly. Eleanor held his gaze. No, Raphael didn't accept that immediately. Yes, you did. A pause. Then lowered her voice slightly. Not something specific, she said. A structure. Raphael studied her. What structure? Eleanor hesitated, then said, This is similar to a case I worked on before I left government advisory work. That was the first full admission of connection. Raphael narrowed his eyes. What case? Eleanor looked away briefly. Supply chain interference investigation, she said. International scope. Raphael watched her carefully. And what happened? Eleanor paused longer this time. Someone was falsely linked to illegal cargo movement through manipulated translation logs and selective documentation exposure. Raphael turned slightly. And what happened to the person accused? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. That silence was enough. Finally, she said, the case collapsed, but the damage was already done. Raphael nodded slowly. Now the structure was clearer. This was just new. It was familiar. And Eleanor was just an interpreter in the system. She had been inside a version of it before. That changed everything. Raphael looked at her for a long moment. You didn't tell me this before. Eleanor met his gaze. You didn't ask. That was true. But incomplete. Raphael understood that too. Before he could respond, the door opened again. Whitmore's legal team requested reconvening. The negotiation continued. But now, every word carried dual weight, surface meaning, and underlying structure. And Eleanor Vale stood between those layers like a translator who had learned that language was not just communication, it was evidence. And evidence, once shaped, could decide everything before a single truth was ever spoken. Eleanor Vale didn't come to the hotel bar that night because she was invited. She came because she couldn't stay in her room anymore. That was the honest version. The professional version would feed in something about needing air, or reviewing notes in a quieter space, or maintaining proximity to the principal client in case of late-stage negotiation shifts. But none of that was true in the way truth mattered right now. The truth was simpler. Something had changed in Raphael Moradi. And worse than that, something had changed in her responsibility to him. And Eleanor Vale did not like variables she could categorize. The bar was on the top floor of the Whitmore Tower, designed for executives who pretended they didn't need alcohol, but still paid for the atmosphere. Dim amber lighting. Quiet jazz that nobody truly listened to. Floor-to-ceiling glass that made London look like a slow-moving circuit board of light and traffic far below. Raphael was already there. Of course he was. He didn't look up when she approached. Just raised two fingers slightly, not as an invitation, but acknowledgement like he had already accounted for her arrival in his mental model of the evening. That irritated her more than it should have. She sat anyway, not across from him, beside him. A calculated decision. Distance mattered less now than control of perspective. For a while, neither of them spoke. Raphael had a glass of dark liquor in front of him, untouched for several minutes. That alone told Eleanor more than most conversations could. He wasn't drinking for taste. He was holding something in place. "You were thinking too loudly," he said finally. Eleanor didn't react immediately. "I didn't know thoughts had volume," she replied. "They do when they were about to become decisions." That made her glance at him. He still wasn't looking at her, just the city below. "Then you should stop guessing mine," she said. "Guessing?" "I am not guessing. A pause. That was the problem. He was. T. Eleanor leaned back slightly, folding one leg over the other. "What do you think I'm deciding?" she asked. Raphael finally turned his head toward her. "Not fully. Just enough." That depends," he said, "on whether you still just an interpreter in this room." The word interpreter landed differently now. Not neutral, not technical. A boundary marker. Eleanor said slowly, "I am still an interpreter," she said. Raphael nodded once. But not only. Sights stretched between them. Below, London kept moving like nothing important was happening. Above it, two people were quietly recalibrating each other. Eleanor reached for the glass of water in front of her instead of ordering alcohol. That, too, was a choice. Raphael noticed everything. "You didn't correct Whitmore today," he said. Eleanor took a sip before answering. "I translated what was said. That's not what you did yesterday." "No," she admitted. A beat. Yesterday was different. Raphael leaned slightly toward her now, because of the suitcase. Eleanor didn't answer immediately, that hesitation again. Raphael waited. He didn't push. He just held silence like pressure until it revealed structure. "Yes," she said finally. That was the first crack. Not in her professionalism, in the containment around it. Raphael studied her face for a long moment.
You recognize what you said.
Eleanor didn't deny it. "That's what you said earlier." "Yes, and I'm asking you what you didn't say earlier." Eleanor looked down at her hands for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, not softer, more precise. "I worked on a case in Geneva," she said, "before Whitmore Consulting, before I went fully independent." Raphael didn't interrupt. "It involved a multinational logistics firm," she continued. "Same structure, different scale. Someone's introduced fabricated uncertainty into cargo records. Not enough to trigger immediate alarm, just enough to create a compliance shadow." Raphael slowly. "And the interpreter?" Eleanor hesitated again, then continued. "In that case, the interpreter was used as a conduit for selective omissions, not lies. Omissions. That was enough." Raphael's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what happened to that interpreter?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. When she did, it was controlled. They lost their accreditation. Silence. That was it. No drama, no tragedy, just professional erasure. Raphael leaned back slightly. "And you were involved in correcting it." Eleanor's eyes lifted. "Yes, that's why you noticed Whitmore." "Yes, because you've seen the mechanism." "Yes," a pause. Then Raphael said, "And the suitcase is the same mechanism." Eleanor nodded once. "It's part of it," she said. "Not the core. But it reinforces the perception layer." Raphael studied her carefully now. Not as an interpreter. Not as a tool. As something else entirely. "You not just translating language," he said. Eleanor didn't respond. "Because that wasn't a question." Raphael continued. "You translating risk." That landed differently. Eleanor's expression tightened slightly. That's not my job, she said. But it's what you redoing. Silence. She did deny it again. Instead, she shifted slightly in her seat. That small movement told Raphael more than words could. She was recalibrating how much to reveal. Why did you tell me this earlier? He asked. Eleanor gave a faint, almost tired look. Because in environments like this, she said, information changes how people treat you before it changes how they understand you. Raphael nodded slowly. So you chose silence, I chose control, a beat. And now, Raphael said, you losing control. That was not an insult. It was observation. Eleanor looked at him directly now. I'm not losing control, she said. I'm adjusting to a system that is actively trying to redefine your position. Raphael smiled faintly at that. Define my position, yes. By what? Eleanor hesitated, then said, by making you appear as a carrier of leverage rather than a negotiator. Raphael leaned back slightly. That is a polite way of saying they think I'm smuggling something, yes. And you believe them. Eleanor shook her head immediately. No. Then what do you believe? A pause. That was the question that mattered. Eleanor looked at the glass wall, at the city beyond it. I believe someone is shaping belief around you, she said quietly. Not evidence, belief. Raphael nodded slowly. That's more dangerous than evidence. Yes. Sides. The jazz in the background felt louder now, though it hadn't changed. Raphael took a sip of his drink for the first time, then set it down again. Tell me about Geneva, he said. Eleanor looked at him sharply. That's not relevant. It is if it explains your hesitation today. A pause. Then she exhaled slowly. Geneva ended badly, she said. Not for the client, for the system. Raphael waited. Eleanor continued. The investigation identified the interference source too late. By the time we corrected the records, contracts had already collapsed, partnerships dissolved. People assumed intent where there was only manipulation. Raphael studied her carefully, and she stayed in that field after. No, she said. That's why you left. Yes. A pause. Then Raphael said, and now you rehear. Eleanor Iramassusk, yes, his gaze. Yes, same pattern. Yes, Raphael leaned slightly forward. Then you know what happens next. Eleanor didn't answer immediately, but her silence answered for her. Yes, she said quietly. Raphael's voice lowered. And what happens next? Eleanor hesitated, then said escalation, then misattribution, then forced resolution. Raphael nodded slowly. And where does the interpreter sit in that sequence? That question changed the air again. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. Usually, she said between escalation and misattribution. Raphael held her gaze. That's a dangerous place to stand. Yes. And yet you've still here. Eleanor looked away briefly. Then back at him. Because you've not the cause of this pattern, she said. But you've inside it. Raphael nodded once. That distinction matters to you. It matters to accuracy. A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed Raphael's face. You very good at accuracy, he said. That's the job. No, Raphael said. That's discipline, not the job. Silence. Eleanor didn't respond, because she knew he was right in a way that didn't help her. Raphael leaned back again. So what do you need, he asked. Eleanor blinked once. I to need anything, that's not true. A pause. Then Raphael added, no one's in this room is operating without need. That was closer to pressure than observation now. Eleanor exhaled slowly. I need clarity, she said finally. On what? On whether continuing this negotiation exposes you to interpretation risk. Raphael nodded slowly. And if it does, Eleanor held his gaze. Then I adjust how I translate accordingly. That was the moment something shifted. Not in the room, between them. Raphael studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, You've already started adjusting. Eleanor didn't deny it. Instead, she said, yes. Silence it again longer this time. Outside, London continued its indifferent rhythm. Inside, something more precise than trust was forming. Not agreement, not alignment, recognition of dependency. Raphael finally spoke again. If I ask you something, he said, will you answer without filtering? Eleanor looked at him. That depends on the question. Raphael nodded. Fair. A pause. Then he said, do you believe I am being set up? Eleanor didn't hesitate this time. Yes. And do you believe I'm aware of the full structure of it? No. Raphael nodded slowly. And do you believe I can still control the outcome? Eleanor paused. Longer then said not alone. That was the truth neither of them had said directly until now. Raphael didn't react outwardly, but something in his posture shifted. Subtle. Acceptance of constraint, not resistance to it, Eleanor noticed. And that changed her expressions slightly because she realized something uncomfortable. He wasn't trying to eliminate dependency, he was mapping it. Raphael reached for his glass again, then stopped. You said earlier, he said, that interpreters usually sit between isolation and misattribution. Yes. What happens was one becomes aware of that position. Eleanor understood the question immediately. And for the first time that night, she hesitated not because of risks, but because of implication. Then they stopped being neutral conduits, she said quietly. Raphael nodded slowly, and become participants. Eleanor did correct him, because she could. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was structured, like a decision being formed without being spoken. Raphael finished his drink, then said quietly, "Tomorrow we continue the negotiation." Eleanor nodded once. "Yes, and you will translate everything." "Yes." Raphael looked at her for a long moment, and nothing else. Eleanor held his gaze. "That's not how this works anymore," she said quietly. Raphael didn't respond immediately, then almost gently he said, "A pause. You rewrite." And for the first time since they had met, neither of them corrected the other. Because both understood the same thing now. Language was no longer just being translated in the room. It was being chosen. And whoever chose it was no longer outside the outcome. The morning after the hotel bar, London doesn't feel different in any visible way. That was the problem. The city never showed you when something important had already begun. Eleanor Vale noticed it anyway. Not in the sky, not in the weather, not even in the Whitmore Tower lobby, where everything still smelled faintly of polished stone and expensive coffee. She noticed it in Raphael Moretti. He was already in the conference room when she arrived, earlier than usual, not impatient, prepared. That difference mattered. Because Raphael didn't prepare like most executives did by reviewing documents or rehearsing talking points. He prepared by understanding people. And today, he had already decided that people in the room were no longer just negotiators. They were signals. Eleanor closed the door behind her quietly. Raphael didn't look up immediately yet, but he spoke. "They were moving early," he said. Eleanor paused for half a second, not because she didn't understand, because she confirmed internally that he meant what she already suspected. "Yes, Wes," she said. "They requested an unscheduled pre-meeting review with legal." Raphael nodded once. "Because of Geneva," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor didn't correct him. Yes, that single word tightened the air between them, because it confirmed what both of them were now operating under. The narrative around Raphael's Moretti was no longer neutral. It was being shaped externally, and everyone inside Whitmore's orbit was reacting to that shape instead of the facts. Raphael finally looked up at her. "You read quieter today," he said. "I am precise today," she replied. That wasn't avoidance. That was recalibration. Raphael understood the distinction immediately. He leaned back slightly. "Good," he said. "We need precision." Eleanor didn't respond, because she was already listening to the room through him now, not just for language, but for structural intent. The door opened. Harrison Switmore entered first, followed by Daniel, legal counsel, and two additional compliance officers Eleanor hadn't seen before. That alone told her something had escalated. Raphael noticed, too. He always noticed. Harrison didn't sit immediately. That was the second signal since delays into they were not negotiating position anymore. They reasserting gravity. Eleanor positioned herself behind and slightly to Raphael's right, her usual place. But today it felt less like translation and more like observation from inside a moving system. Harrison's first. "We've received additional inquiries regarding your European shipping pathways," he said. Eleanor translated without modification. Raphael nodded once. "From whom?" Eleanor translated. Harrison paused. "That information is currently not disclosed," he said. Eleanor translated again. But this time, she noticed something inside the phrasing. Not in the words. In the structure. Not disclosed meant protected. Protected meant initiated externally. Someone wasn't just asking questions. Someone was guiding which questions were allowed to exist. Raphael noticed her pause. He didn't look at her, but he registered it. "Continue," he said. Harrison slid a folder onto the table. This concerns a pattern anomaly flagged by regulatory cross-check systems, he said. This Eleanor translated. Raphael Luciel opened the folder. He didn't rush. That was important, because rushing would have signaled defensiveness. Instead, he read it like someone reviewing weather reports, not accusations. Eleanor watched him while translating the accompanying dialogue, and she saw something she hadn't seen before, not uncertainty, containment. He already understood this was none about logistics. It was about positioning. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward slightly. We need clarification regarding any external handling agents used in your southern route shipments, he said. Eleanor translated. Raphael responded immediately. There are third-party logistics partners, all declared, he said. Eleanor translated, but Harrison interrupted. This does not appear inconsistent with prior filings, he said. Eleanor translated again, and this time Raphael looked at her, not at the table, at her, because she hesitated before translating does not appear consistent. Just a fraction, but enough. That meant she understood something on the sentence. Raphael didn't speak. He waited. Eleanor delivered the translation exactly, but her eyes didn't leave the page in front of her. Raphael made a mental note. She was no longer smoothing reality. She was exposing it. The meeting continued, but now every sentence felt like a probe rather than a negotiation. Eleanor began to notice something else. The Whitmore team was unified in intent. Harrison was focused. Daniel was reactive. Legal counsel was cautious. But one of the compliance officers someone knew kept referencing documents that weren't part of the original briefing package. That meant external insertion, not organic inquiry. Someone had introduced material into the system. Eleanor Sess' attention sharpened. She began tracking not just language, but origin of reference points. And that S, when she noticed it. A phrase repeated across multiple exchanges. Historical compliance deviation. It was naturally arising from discussion. It was being inserted, reinforced, steered. Eleanor's stumps tightened slightly, because she had seen this before, not in Whitmore, in Geneva. But she said nothing yet, not because she was withholding, because she was confirming. Raphael stood once during the meeting break. He walked toward the glass wall again. Eleanor followed after a delay, not immediately. That delay was intentional now, because she had begun to understand something dangerous proximities in this environment. Proximities meant implication. Raphael didn't turn when she approached. You saw it, he said. Eleanor didn't ask what. Yes, that phrase, he continued. It's being used too often, this silence. Then Raphael said, it's not theirs. Cicero looked at him. What do you mean? That language, he said, it did to originate in this room. Eleanor felt a small shift in her chest, because she had already reached the same conclusion. But hearing him say it meant he was thinking in the same structural layer now. Yes, she said quietly. Raphael finally turned. Explain it. Eleanor hesitated, then chose precision. It's compliance framing language, she said, used to convert ambiguity into structured suspicion. Raphael nodded slowly. And who uses it? Eleanor paused. Regulatory advisory firms. Raphael studied her and Geneva. That wasn't a question. Eleanor exhaled yes. A silence followed that was different from earlier silences. This one had weight. Because it connected systems, not events. Raphael stepped closer slightly. You said before, he said, that you worked on something similar. Yes. And you left. Yes. Because of this. Eleanor nodded once. Yes. Raphael watched her carefully. Tell me what you didn't tell me. Eleanor hesitated, not out of avoidance, out of structure. Then she said in Geneva, the interpreter wasn't just misused. Raphael didn't interrupt. They were used as a validation channel, she continued, to confirm pre-built interpretations in meetings where outcomes had already been socially engineered. Raphael's eyes narrowed slightly. And you recognize that? Yes. And corrected it? Yes. A pause. Eleanor looked away briefly. Correction was treated as interference, she said. Raphael nodded slowly. Of course it was. Silence again. But now it was abstract. It was aligned. Raphael turned slightly toward the room. Whitmore is being pulled into that structure, he said. Eleanor nodded. Yes, and I am inside it, yes. Raphael looked back at her. And you? Eleanor hesitated, then said, I am already inside it. That was the first fully honest alignment of position, not roles. Positions. Raphael studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, Then you understand why I need accuracy. Eleanor nodded. I already understood that. Raphael tilted his head slightly. No, he said. You understood translation. A pause. I need something else now. Eleanor met his gaze. What? Raphael's voice lowered slightly. I need you to recognize when language is being used as architecture. That landed differently, because it wasn't about words anymore. It was about construction. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Then she said quietly, I already am. That was the truth. But now it had consequences. The door opened again. Meeting resumed. But Eleanor's internal process had changed. She was no longer just converting meaning. She was identifying manipulation layers embedded within meaning. And Raphael, listening to her translations, began to notice something new. She was to just accurate. She was selectively revealing structure, not changing truth, exposing design. At one point, Daniel Whitmore asked a question about unreported routing irregularities. Eleanor translated, but added nothing. Yet Raphael heard something in her tone, a warning embedded in neutrality. And he acted on it immediately. Define irregularities, he said. Eleanor translated. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation confirmed everything, because undefined accusations are never about clarity. They are about anchoring suspicion without responsibility. Raphael nodded once. I see, he said. Eleanor translated, and in that moment, Harrison Whitmore looked at Eleanor directly, not Raphael. Eleanor. That shift was immediate and sharp, because now the interpreter had become visible as a node of interpretation authority. Harrison spoke directly to her. Eleanor translated it for Raphael, but her expression tightened, because the sentence wasn't neutral. It was an assessment. Raphael watched her carefully. What did he say? Raphael asked after she finished. Ellis hesitated, then said, He said you rely heavily on my interpretation. Raphael nodded slowly. And what did you say? Eleanor paused, then answered, I said that's the point of moral silence, but Raphael knew that wasn't the full truth, because her eyes didn't match her words. The meeting concluded shortly after. Not resolved, not escalated, just suspended, which was more dangerous than both. When the room cleared, Raphael remained seated. Eleanor didn't immediately leave. That was new. She stayed. Raphael finally spoke. You are not just interpreting anymore, he said. Eleanor didn't deny it. No. A pause. Then Raphael asked, when did it change? Eleanor considered that, then said, when I recognized the structure. And when was that? She looked at him.
Yesterday?
Silence. Raphael nodded slowly. So we already inside it. Eleanor nodded once. Yes. Raphael leaned back slightly. And now? Eleanor's voice lowered. Now we decide whether to stay its unconscious or let it define the outcome without us. Raphael studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, That's not translation. Eleanor met his gaze. No, she said, it's navigation. And for the first time, Raphael did correct her. The call from Marco came at 2:17 a.m. London time. Raphael Moretti was already awake. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed when she entered the suite 10 minutes later. What's he? In bed. Wasn't. Renzen. Mean even pretending to decompress from the today's meeting. He was sitting at the small desk near the window, phone on speaker, a single glass of water untouched beside him, and the room felt different. Not tense. Focused. Like something had finally decided to reveal its shape. Eleanor closed the door quietly behind her. Raphael didn't look at her immediately, but he shifted the phone slightly so she could hear, Say it again, Raphael said. Marco's voice crackled through, uneven, strained. I told you already, Marco said. I didn't know what it was. I was told to place it inside your luggage liner and forget it existed. That's all. Eleanor didn't move closer yet. She stayed just inside the edge of the room listening. Not just to the words, to the structure of fear inside them. Raphael leaned forward slightly. Who told you? He said, a pause. Too long. That alone was an answer. I don't know his names, Marco said finally. Italian accent, but not native. Southern cadence, maybe trained. He knew your trust clauses before it was finalized. That's what I told you. Raphael's jaw tightened slightly. Eleanor noticed that shift, not anger, compression. It's like something inside him had just narrowed into focus. And you sure he spoke Italian with you? Raphael asked. Yes. Fluent. Technically, yes, Marco said. But something was off. Stress patterns. Like he learned it later in life. Eleanor stepped forward slowly now, not interrupting. just positioning herself within hearing range. Raphael glanced at her briefly, not for permission. For confirmation of interpretation, she gave a sus nod. Continue. Raphael spoke again, describes the accent. Marcos hesitated. I can tit, he said. It was tit consistent, sometimes Germanic rhythm, sometimes something Eastern European underneath it. That changed everything in Eleanor's mind instantly. Because now it was so just a single source. It was constructed languaged behavior, layered learning patterns, deliberate masking. Raphael ended the call without another word. The silence that now followed, once empty, it was organized. He set the phone down slowly, then leaned back, and for the first time since Eleanor had known him, Raphael didn't immediately try to control the narrative. He simply let it exist. That was more dangerous than anger. Eleanor stepped closer. Marco is telling the truth, she said quietly. Raphael didn't look at her. I know. That was new. Eleanor paused. You already knew. Yes, silence. Then Eleanor asked, since when? Raphael turned slightly toward the window. Since the suitcase appeared, he said. That landed heavier than she expected. Because it meant he hadn't been reacting. He had been tracing. Eleanor exhaled slowly. You didn't tell me. Raphael finally looked at her. You didn't to ask the right question. That was not deflection. That was structure. Eleanor understood immediately. What question should I have asked? Raphael stood slowly now, walked toward the window. Outside, London was still moving like nothing was wrong. Inside, everything was shifting. Who benefits from me losing control of interpretation? He said. Eleanor froze slightly, because that was a business question. That was a systems question, and it reframed everything. She thought for a moment, then answered carefully. Anyone who needs your negotiation outcomes to become unpredictable. Raphael nodded once. And who controls unpredictability in systems like this? Eleanor hesitated, then said, those who can introduce ambiguity into communication channels. Raphael turned back to her. Exactly, silence. Then Eleanor said that S.Y. Marco was used. Raphael nodded again, yes. A pause. And not because of the document, she continued. No, because of you. Raphael didn't deny it. The silence was confirmation. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. Because now the structure was complete. This wasn't about leverage. It was about destabilization through interpretation disruption, and she was inside the mechanism. Raphael walked back toward the desks, sat again, slowly, controlled. Then said, there is something you need to understand. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She waited, Raphael continued. This is not a negotiation anymore. Eleanor nodded slightly. I know. No, Raphael said. You that made her still. Raphael looked at her directly now. This is containment, silence. Eleanor felt the word settle into the room like weight. Containment, not negotiation, not conflict. Containment implied boundaries, pressure control, external monitoring. Raphael continued. And you are now inside the containment boundary with me. Eleanor didn't deny it, because she couldn't. Instead, she said quietly, when did you realize that? Raphael leaned forward slightly. I stopped receiving clean data. That was precise. The Eleanor understood immediately. Whitmore. Yes, silence. Then she asked, you think they re-involved? Raphael shook his head slightly. No, that surprised her. Then who? Raphael paused. Looked at Eleanor. The Eller knew he was choosing what to reveal. Finally, he said, not Whitmore. A beat, something adjacent. Eleanor narrowed her eyes slightly. Regulatory advisor. Rel nodded. Step. Or someone feeding them structured suspicion frameworks. Eleanor felt it click to place. Geneva model, she said quietly. Raphael looked at her sharply. You recognize it? Yes. Silence. That changed everything again, because now they were not just reacting to interference. They were inside a known architecture of interference. Raphael stood again, walked a few steps, then turned back. Tell me what you saw in Geneva, he said. Eleanor hesitated, not because she didn't want to answer, because she understood what answering would activate. Then she spoke. There was a sequence, she said. First, minor inconsistencies were introduced into documentation flows. Nothing actionable, just enough to trigger internal audits. Raphael nodded. Then communication channels were selectively interpreted by third-party reviewers who had no operational context, she continued. And then, Eleanor paused. Then outcomes were reframed as compliance risk indicators instead of operational anomalies. Raphael studied her carefully, and the interpreter. Eleanor exhaled slowly, became the most trusted source of clarity inside the system, she said. Raphael nodded slowly, and then removed. Yes, silence. Then Raphael said, "That's what this is." Eleanor didn't respond because it was. Raphael stepped closer now. "You read the interpreter," he said quietly. "Yes. And you are the most trusted source of clarity in this system." Eleanor felt the weight of that statement immediately. Yes. Raphael nodded once. "And that makes you a target node." Eleanor didn't deny it. Silence stretched. Then Raphael said something unexpected. "You should leave." Eleanor blinked once. "What? You should leave the system," he said, "before it closes around you." That was not emotional. That was structural logic. Eleanor shook her head slightly. "That one T stop it. It reduces exposure." "It does T remove my position in it," she said. Raphael studied her. "And you think staying does?" As Eleanor hesitated. Then said, "I think leaving guarantees I lose visibility." Silence. Raphael sat back slightly. "So you re-staying?" Eleanor nodded once. "Yes." Another pause. Then Raphael said quietly, "Then we adjust." That word again. "Adjust. Not resist, not fight." "Adjust," Eleanor looked at him. "Adjust how?" Raphael turned toward the desk, opened a folder. Inside were printed shipping logs, annotated in his handwriting. He slid them toward her. "I stop relying on external interpretation layers," he said, "and I rely only on you." Eleanor didn't move immediately. She looked at the papers, then at him. "That increases my exposure," she said. "Yes, that makes me the single point of failure." Yes. Silence. Eleanor felt the implications in fully now. This wasn't in partnership. This was consolidation of interpretive authority, and that meant responsibility, risk, visibility. She looked at him carefully. "You retransferring interpretive dependency onto me," she said. Raphael nodded. "Yes, and you understand what that means." "Yes." A pause. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "You removing redundancy," she said. "Yes." "In a containment environment." "Yes." Silence. Then Eleanor said quietly, "That is dangerous." Raphael nodded. "Yes, but controlled," she added. Raphael looked at her. "If you are precise, that landed differently." Because now the entire system depended on precision of one person's interpretation. Eleanor Vale felt that weight settle fully. Then she asked, "What if I am wrong?" Raphael hesitate. "Then we both fail." Silence. That was the first fully honest risk alignment between them. No insulation, no hierarchy. Shared consequence. Eleanor looked down at the documents, then back at him. "You rebetting everything on interpretation fidelity," she said. Raphael nodded. "Yes." A pause. "And why me?" she asked. Raphael looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Because you already saw the structure before I did." Silence. That answer was not emotional. It was analytical, and that made it more serious. Eleanor closed the folder slowly, then said, "Then we need to identify the origin point." Raphael nodded. "Yes, and Marco isn't it? No. And Whitmore isn't it? No." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Then we re-looking at upstream orchestration." Yes. Silence. Then she said quietly, "Someone who understands language systems." Raphael nodded. "Yes. And supply chain timing." Yes. And internal communication dependencies. Yes. Eleanor looked at him. "That narrows it significantly." Raphael nodded once. "It does." Silence. Then Eleanor asked, "What's your next move?" Raphael leaned back slightly. "We continue the meeting tomorrow," he said, "and we observe who reacts to interpretive shifts." Eleanor understood immediately. "You going to test the system?" "Yes." "How?" Raphael looked at her. "By changing how you translate." That landed sharply. Eleanor felt it immediately. "You want to introduce control deviation?" "Yes." Silence. Eleanor shook her head slightly. "That increases detection risk." "Yes."
Exposure.
"Yes." A pause. "And if they re-monitoring interpretive consistency," she said slowly, "they'll notice immediately." Raphael nodded. "Exactly." Silence. Then Eleanor said quietly, "So you want to provoke a response?" "To locate the source." "Yes." Eleanor studied him. "That's not negotiation," she said. Raphael looked at her. "No," he said. "That's extraction." Silence. The room felt different again, because now they were no longer inside a misunderstanding. They were inside a controlled experiment. Eleanor finally spoke. "If I do this," she said, "there's no neutrality left." Raphael nodded. "Yes, and no fallback interpretation layer." "Yes, and no correction buffer." "Yes." Silence. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "Then we do it carefully," she said. Raphael nodded one yes. A pause. Then he added quietly, together. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Then she said, together. And for the first time since Marco's call, the system didn't feel like it was closing in. It felt like they had started to see its edges. Raphael Minoretti didn't sleep that night, neither did Eleanor Vale. But they didn't talk about it. There was all kind of silence between them now. That wasn't an absence of communication, it was compression. Everything unnecessary had already been stripped away. What remained was structure, timing, and the quiet awareness that whatever happened next would not be reversible. Morning came gray over London, the kind of light that made the city look older than it actually was. The meeting with Whitmore Industries was scheduled for 9 a.m. at their Canary Wharf office. By 8:12, Raphael and Eleanor were already in the car. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes, not because there was nothing to say, because anything said too early becomes dislicenant. Eleanor reviewed her notes once more, but her handwriting was already familiar enough that she was reading it anymore. She was checking rhythm, pattern, what she had decided to emphasize, and more importantly, what she had decided to slightly shift. Raphael noticed her silence. You re-changing something, he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor didn't come. Yes. A pause. Tell me. I'm adjusting tone density, she said, reducing direct equivalence, increasing interpretive neutrality. Raphael turned slightly toward her. That S not neutral. No, she agreed. It S-controlled ambiguity. Silence settled again. Then Raphael nodded once. Good. That was all. No approval beyond necessity, no curiosity beyond function. That was how they worked now. At 8:47, then the car slowed near Canary Wharf. The glass towers rose like vertical systems of control, each one reflecting the others, in a way that made direction feel optional and exit feel theoretical. Eleanor looked out the window. This is the kind of place that thinks it's in charge of information, she said quietly. Raphael followed her gaze. It is, he said, until someone changes the language. That was the only warning he gave her. Inside Whitmore Industries, everything looked exactly as expected. Too clean? Too precise. The kind of corporate environment designed to make unpredictability feel like a misunderstanding rather than a threat. They were greeted in a glass conference room on the 42nd floor. 3 Whitmore executives were already seated, but Eleanor noticed something immediately. There were 4 microphones on the table, not 3. That details settled in her mind like a small weight. Raphael noticed it too. He didn't react, but his attention narrowed. Eleanor sat placing her notebook exactly parallel to the table edge. Small disciplines, visible control. The lead Whitmore executive, a man named Caldwell, smiled as they entered. Mr. Moretti, he said warmly, and Ms. Vale, we're glad you could make it. Eleanor translated into the tone she had already decided. Not warmer, not colder, just slightly delayed sincerity. Raphael watched her more than he watched Caldwell. Because what Matt now announced of what was said, it was what was allowed to survive translation. Caldwell began the meeting with standard framing, say, market positioning, logistics optimization, cross-border regulatory alignment, all predictable, all safe. Until the third slide, that was when Eleanor noticed the shift. A subtle calibration in Caldwell's phrasing, not in content, in structure. He was testing them. Looking for response patterns, Eleanor leaned slightly toward Raphael and translated, but she introduced a small variance, not distortion, but emphasis redistribution. Raphael caught it instantly. His eyes shifted slightly toward her. She didn't look back. Not yet, Caldwell continued. And of course, he said casually, we've taken into account recent uncertainties in your operational pipeline, particularly those involving internal documentation discrepancies. There it was. The hook. Eleanor translated it exactly once, then paused half a beat longer than necessary. That pause mattered. Raphael felt it, because it changed the room temperature, not dramatically, but detectably. He responded calmly. Which uncertainties, he said. Caldwell smiled. Let's not pretend you unaware. Eleanor translated again, but this time she softened in the certainty in Caldwell's statement. Not what he meant, but how confidently it could be received. Raphael leaned back slightly. Interesting, he said. That word was deliberate. It was agreement. It was denial. It was invitation. Caldwell took it. That was the mistake, because now it's been dead. We understand there may have been external interference in your recent logistics chain, Caldwell continued. We would hate for misunderstandings to escalate into regulatory exposure. Eleanor felt it immediately. This wasn't a Whitmore acting independently. This was coordinated insertion. Someone had prepared them, or briefed them, or both. She translated carefully, but this time she added nothing, no smoothing, no interpretive cushioning. Raphael heard the raw structure of the threat, and something in his posture changed slightly. Not aggression, recognition. He turned toward Caldwell. Who told you that? He asked. Caldwell blinked. Excuse me? Eleanor translated exactly. This time she did not adjust anything. The room shifted, because now the question had become unstable. Caldwell recovered quickly. Standard industry intelligence, he said. Raphael nodded slowly. Industry intelligence? He repeated. Then he looked at Eleanor briefly. Just one glance. That was the signal. She understood, now. She shifted her translation strategy, not toward accuracy, toward pressure exposure. Every sentence from that moment forward would carry full weight, no insulation. Caldwell continued, slightly less confident now. We simply ensuring all parties maintain compliance integrity throughout this transition period. Eleanor translated, but now she allowed silence to land harder between clauses. Raphael listened carefully, then said, There is no transition. Caldwell frowned slightly. Eleanor translated. Caldwell glanced at his colleagues. That was the first crack. Raphael continued. There is only what is known and what is assumed. Eleanor translated again, but this time she altered one structural emphasis, not meaning but hierarchy. In English, Raphael's sentence was neutral philosophy. In translation, it became challenge. Caldwell felt it. The room tightened. One of the other executives leaned forward. Mr. Moretti, we simply trying to ensure no party is exposed to unnecessary risk. Eleanor translated, but this time she inserted a cultural register shift she had never used before in this room. Not softer, not harder, more final. Raphael noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. The room reacted before they understood why, because now the conversation had become asymmetric, not in content, in interpretation control. Caldwell stopped smiling. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should revisit the documentation provided last week. That was it. That was the trigger. Eleanor felt it before it fully formed. The word documentation had been used too precisely, too intentionally. Raphael leaned forward slightly. Which documentation, he asked. Eleanor translated. But now she slowed cadence deliberately. Each surd separates us just enough to force cognitive processing. Caldwell hesitated. That hesitation confirmed everything. Raphael saw it. Eleanor saw it. They both understood. Something inside Whitmore's framings had been preloaded. Not intelligence. Influence. Caldwell adjusted. The shipping reconciliation files, he said. Raphael turned slightly toward Eleanor, just enough for her to see his question without words. She answered silently, with one blink. Yes, this was it. The insertion point. Raphael nodded once, then said calmly, Those files are incomplete. Eleanor translated, but now she made one small structural adjustment. She removed certainty from Whitmore's assumed authority, not from Raphael's statement, from their confidence in questioning it. That changed the atmosphere again. Caldwell's voice sharpened slightly.
Incomplete according to whose assessment? Raphael didn't he respond immediately.
He looked at Eleanor. That was enough. She understood. Now escalation. She translated his next words, exactly spoken. No modulation, no interpretation buffer. According to mine. Silence hit the room. Not dramatic. Precise. Caldwell stared at him. You re-saying you've reviewed them personally. Raphael nodded. Yes, that was not true, not entirely, but it didn't matter. Because what mattered now was who controlled verification pathways. And Caldwell knew it. Eleanor felt it shift. Whitmore was losing narrative control, not because of force, because of interpretive instability. Caldwell tried to recover. We may need to escalate this internally, he said carefully. Eleanor translated, but this time she allowed the implication to fully land. No softening, no diplomacy buffer. Raphael nodded. Please do. That was the end of it. Not because the meeting concluded, but because the structure collapsed. Caldwell realized they were no longer operating in informational symmetry. Something had changed. Someone in the room was now contesting language itself as a weapon. And they didn't know who, or how, or why. The meeting ended 10 minutes later, formally, but without resolution, just containment. When they exited the building, the air outside felt strangely ordinary. That was always the illusion after structural confrontation. Nothing looked different, even though everything had shifted. In the car, silence returned, but this time it was different. Not compression, resolution pressure. Raphael finally spoke. They Ruby not the source, he said. Eleanor nodded once. No. They re-receiving structure, he continued. Yes. A pause. Then he looked at her. They reacted exactly where you shifted tone. Eleanor nodded again. Yes. Silence. Raphael leaned back slightly, which means the system is watching interpretation. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Yes. Another pause. Then Raphael said quietly, now we know how to find it. Eleanor looked at him. How? Raphael turned toward the window. We make it misread us again. And for the first time that day, Eleanor Vale understood exactly what kind of war they were actually in. The airport in Milan was quieter than Eleanor Vale expected. Not empty, never empty, but softened, like even the noise had learned to respect distance. Raphael Moretti stood near the glass wall overlooking the runway, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding a folded document he hadn't opened in hours. Eleanor stood a few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to decide not to. They had not talked much since London, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything important now existed in what was not being said. Raphael finally broke the silence without turning. They stopped the interference, he said. Eleanor nodded slightly. Yes, a pause. But they didn't stop watching, she added. Raphael gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That's enough, he said. Eleanor looked at him then. You are not concerned. I am, he corrected. I am calibrated, that word again. Calibrate safe, not safe but stable, adjusted to risk. A final adjustment instead of a resolution. Eleanor stepped closer. So what happens now? Raphael finally turned toward her. For the first time in days, there was no operational distance in his expression, just clarity. Now, he said, we stop reacting.
Silence.
Then he added, and we start deciding what they re-allowed to see. Eleanor understood immediately. Control had shifted again, not to force, to visibility. What do you want them to see? She asked. Raphael looked back at the runway. A version of me that thinks in transactions, he said, and a version of you that only translates. Eleanor didn't respond right away, because she understood the implication. That meant hiding structure mispreeth performance. Layered truth, controlled interpretation again but reversed. You want to become predictable, she said quietly. I want to become as legible, Raphael corrected. That distinction mattered. Predictable could be exploited, legible could be mapped, but only if the map was real. Eleanor studied him. And what are we actually doing? She asked. Raphael finally looked at her directly. We are removing the person who builds meaning out of our conversations, he said. Silence. That landed heavier than anything before, because it confirmed what they both already knew. This was never just about logistics, or documents, or corporate interference. It was about interpretation itself becoming a battlefield. Eleanor exhaled slowly, and when we find time, she said, what then? Raphael did answer immediately. Then he said, we let them hear what they built. A plane roared somewhere beyond the glass. Neither of them moved. Because now movement was no longer physical. It was strategic. Eleanor nodded once. Then we do it carefully, she said. Raphael looked at her. We already are. A long pause followed. Not uncomfortable. Finalizing. Then Eleanor reached into her bag and took out her notebook. The same one she had carried since Seoul. She opened it, flipped past pages of structured notes, language adjustments, tonal mappings, risk markers, then stopped at a blank page. Raphael watched her. She didn't explain. She simply wrote one line. Not a translation, not a report. A decision. When she finished, she closed the notebook and handed it to him. Raphael didn't open it immediately. He just held it. You are sure, he said quietly. Eleanor met his eyes. No, she said, but I understand the system now. That was enough. Raphael opened the notebook, read the single line, then closed it again without reaction. But something in his posture changed, not tension, alignment. He returned the notebook. Then he said. Eleanor nodded. Yes, Then she asked, softer now, what happens after this? Raphael looked at the runway again. For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was lower. I don't know, he said. For the first time, that feels acceptable. Eleanor almost smiled at that, almost. Instead, she just nodded. Plane began its slow movement toward takeoff. Inside, everything else had already lifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly, Raphael turned slightly toward her. You did something in London, he said. I did a lot of things in London. You chose how the room understood me, he clarified. Eleanor didn't deny it. Yes. A pause. That changes outcomes, he said. It changes relationships, she corrected. Silence. Then Raphael nodded once. Good, he said. Not approval? Recognition. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. Is this it? She asked. Raphael looked at her. No, he said. This is where it starts being honest. A final announcement echoed through the terminal. Boarding. Different directions. Different destinations. Eleanor adjusted her bag strap. Raphael stepped slightly closer. Not enough to cross distance, just enough to acknowledge it. I'll need you in Madrid in 6 weeks, he said. Eleanor raised his eyebrow. That wasn't a question. It wasn't meant to be. A faint pause. And after that, she asked. Raphael considered it, then said, after that, we see what remains when nothing is being hidden. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded. Send the itinerary, she said. Raphael gave a small nod. I will. They stood there for a final second. No farewell speech, no emotional resolution, just acknowledgement that something had been understood correctly for the first in both of their lives. Then Eleanor turned and walked toward her gate. Raphael stayed where he was, watching the runway, still holding the notebook's echo in his mind, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was controlling the world. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locales is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences. Felt like he was finally reading it accurately.
At its surface, this story may look like a mafia negotiation thriller. Powerful men, international business, hidden documents, and quiet threats behind polished corporate doors. But the real conflict of the story was never about crime, money, or even control in the traditional sense. It was about something far more invisible and far more dangerous. Interpretation. Raphael Moretti begins the story as a man who believes control is absolute. In his world, power means being the one who decides outcomes, sets terms, and defines reality. But when he enters a country where he does not speak the language, that illusion breaks. For the first time, he cannot directly access meaning. He cannot fully trust what is being said around him. He must rely on someone else, Eleanor Vale, to transform reality into something he can act upon. And that is where the true lesson begins. Eleanor is not just a translator. She is a filter of truth, a selector of tone, and a quiet architect of meaning. Through her, we learn that communication is never neutral. Every sentence carries intention, but also interpretation. Every word can be shaped, softened, sharpened, or redirected, depending on who holds the responsibility of translation. In a sense, she becomes the most powerful person in the room, not because she speaks the most, but because she determines how others are understood. The moral tension of the story arises when Raphael realizes something uncomfortable. Control is not about speaking louder or commanding more authority. Control is about being understood correctly, and misunderstanding, whether accidental or engineered, can shift outcomes more than any weapon or negotiation tactic ever could. But the deeper moral lesson is not about manipulation or dominance. It is about responsibility. Eleanor's role forces a question that exists far beyond business or power structures. What is the ethical weight of interpreting someone else's truth? When does translation become influence? And when does influence become distortion? She learns that clarity is not always the same as honesty, and that protecting people sometimes means choosing what they are not ready to hear. Meanwhile, Raphael learns a different lesson: humility. For a man built on certainty, he is forced to accept dependency. And in that dependency, he discovers something he never had before: trust that is not based on fear or hierarchy, but on precision and respect. Ultimately, this story is not about mafia power. It is about human perception. It teaches that reality is often constructed in the space between words, and that the person who controls meaning can shape outcomes without ever raising their voice. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: true power is not the ability to control others. It is the ability to be understood without being distorted.